Hi, good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, depending on where in the world you are. My name is Daphne Lazar Price, and I am the Executive Director of Jofa, the Jewish Orthodox Feminist Alliance. It is my honor and my pleasure to welcome you all today for our webinar conversation called Mental Health, You and Us, in partnership with No Shame on You and the Hebrew Institute of Riverdale. And I also want to take a moment to thank Porat and Yeshivat Maharat, Eshel and Tamod and the International Rabbinic Fellowship for their community partnership on this. And just a quick word about the webinar. Nearly 1 in 5 adults struggles with mental health conditions. And we welcome you to join us as we explore how we can be supportive individually and on a community basis as we support people with lived experience and their caregivers. I want to it's my honor and my pleasure to introduce our panelist today. Rabbanit Bracha Jaffe serves as the Associate Rabbah at the Hebrew Institute of Riverdale in the Bronx. She's a dynamic and thoughtful educator who loves teaching in Hebrew or English and inspiring others to learn. She has taught many to Lane and is the voice of the Jofa Megillat Esther and Megillat Root apps, and is also the voice actually of all of the Megillot which appear on our website. Rabbanit Bracha cares deeply about social injustice and has joined a rabbinic cohort working on improving conditions and offering pastoral care to inmates at Rikers Island. She is leading initiatives around communal education in response to anti-Semitism, as well as guiding her community to become more welcoming to Jews of color. Rabbanit Bracha has spoken openly from the pulpit regarding mental health issues. She is passionate about bringing this topic out of the shadows to help remove the social stigma and enable individuals and families to receive empathy and support. I just want to add here that Rabbanit Bracha is joining us wearing 2 hats. She's here as a clergy leader who believes deeply in halacha, supporting those who are experiencing mental health challenges, and she also will be sharing her own personal story here. I also want to introduce Dr. Anat Geva, who's the Director of Strategic Initiatives of No Shame on You. Anat, where she oversees the expansion and implementation of new mental health initiatives, and she also advances organizational support efforts. Anat has been a member of the Board of Trustees at various Jewish nonprofits, including Camp Young Judea Midwest, Oroth Center for Jewish Learning, and is a past board president and current chair of development at Chicago Jewish Day School. She has a bachelor's in science and psychology from the University of Toronto, a joint PhD in cognitive neuroscience and clinical psychology from the University of Michigan, and a JD from the Northwestern University Pritzker School of Law. I also want to take a moment to share a few words about the organization, No Shame on You. It is a not-for-profit organization in Chicago dedicated to eliminating the stigma associated with mental health conditions so people who need help will seek it. And family and friends will know how to provide proper support and to save lives. The organization is rooted in Jewish values and works tirelessly to achieve its mission by creating and delivering innovative evidence-based programming, including presentations led by experts and those with lived experience, community outreach programs, workshops, and support groups, as well as by developing and distributing crisis and mental health resources. No Shame on You also has an online presence, including 125,000 social media followers to whom the organization provides daily tools and resources, including a mental health podcast and a weekly blog. So the question is, why are we having this conversation? Why this? Why now? And I just want to name a few things that I'm noticing. I want to talk about the current moment that we're living in of general discontent in the post-COVID life, the rise of anti-Semitism, the war in Ukraine, general unrest politically, and also, the things we hear on the news about beloved celebrities and people who we think are close to us, in addition to the people who are close to us who are experiencing mental health issues. I also want to name that as I look at the list of people, that there is a disproportionate number of attendees who are women. And I find that interesting. I just want to name something that we're not going to be doing here. We're not giving out one-on-one advice, and we're not giving out medical guidance. But the ultimate goal for this program today is to normalize the experience for everyone, to destigmatize it, to be able to talk about it, to be able to ask for help about it. So I'm going to open with a broad question that I'm going to pose to Anat, Dr. Geva, and that is, spend a moment and tell us, what is mental illness?
Thank you. All right. The way I'm going to do this actually is I have a little PowerPoint that we can follow along as I speak. Just want to confirm, can you see it so far? Okay, there we are. All right. But let's start by answering the question. All right. So, mental illness is a growing problem, actually, and it is quite common. In fact, I'm going to say that everyone on this call and everyone's neighbor who's not on this call has either themselves struggled with a mental health condition or knows somebody who has. And in fact, as you mentioned before, 20% of youth and adults in the United States experience a mental health disorder. And actually, according to the CDC, over one's lifetime, 50% of people are going to experience some kind of mental health disorder. So that's a lot of people. Also, I always like to highlight the fact that half of all mental health challenges begin by the age of 14 and 75% by the age of 24. It's not that I want to bore people with statistics, but I just think that's really important for people to know, because part of what that says to me is that if you see a kid who's struggling, don't ignore it. You actually want to sort of address what's happening as early as possible. So, and the other thing actually to also note is that mental health problems were worsening well before the pandemic. I think the only silver lining that I can see right now about the pandemic is that it has allowed people to talk more, and there's been more awareness about mental health struggles in our community. I think what I'll do is I'll also just talk a little bit about what a mental health disorder is at this point. I want to contrast that with what are sort of daily negative feelings that people might experience, right? So everyday feelings, they could be negative or positive, and they come and go. And these are normal reactions to things that are happening in our lives. So we can feel angry or stressed or really sad. If it's transient and therefore could possibly be motivating, then we're not as concerned about it, right? So this is when I talk to teens, or I say, like, you did poorly on a math test, and you were really upset about it, and you went home and you were sad, and you actually didn't feel like eating dinner that night. And maybe you didn't feel like talking to any of your friends, but 2 days later, when you started, the next math chapter, you actually spent you spent a little bit longer on math that day because you were now motivated to not repeat what happened on the previous math test. In contrast, when we have these overwhelming, intense feelings that hang around for a while, then that's when we start to worry. So this is, again, this teenager who came home, did poorly on their math test, but and they're sad. But this time, what's happening is the kid starts to, think to themselves, this just proves I'm not good at anything. I can't do anything right. I'm such a failure. You go to your room, you don't come out for dinner. But that actually happens for a few weeks. This is happening where you're starting to sort of withdraw. You're starting to not sleep well. Your eating patterns are changing, either too much or too little. When this starts to happen, that's when we start to worry, right? And so what we're looking at that point is, are there certain behaviors that might be of note? So are we looking at someone who's starting to have trouble focusing, trouble getting along, maybe acting out a little bit? We're looking at emotions. Is this someone who's constantly worrying about how things are going to work out with little kids or even teens or even adults, actually, but particularly when they're younger? We're looking at irritability. Is this a new emotion? Is there sadness? Are there thoughts that we're worrying about? And this might come out in terms of self-disparaging talk, like, I can't do this. I'm not good at anything. I'm just a waste of air, of space. Or physical symptoms include things like digestive issues, right? GI issues like my stomach hurts or headaches. So when these symptoms interfere with daily functioning and or with forming relationships, then we need to be concerned. we need to be concerned if this is happening for a few weeks, so to get a clinical diagnosis, you're looking at least 2 weeks of time. And the other thing we're looking at is there some sort of change from prior behavior, right? So the kid who always came home and was really happy to read a book after school and never, was dying to go to play soccer, that's not the kid we're necessarily worried about. We're worried about the kid who was, gung-ho about soccer, lived and breathed soccer, and now suddenly doesn't want to go to practice. And then the other thing I would say is I'd be less concerned, I'm generally speaking less concerned about getting a diagnosis and more concerned about, are there symptoms, behaviors that indicate that this person that something has gone awry, that things aren't as they used to be. Now, insurance companies, they do care about diagnosis, but in terms of the point at which you should be concerned about a family member or yourself, has there been some kind of change? And am I just not as satisfied, let's say, with the way things are going, and are things sort of upsetting me? Some of the more common mental health disorders for adults, we're talking about anxiety disorders, major depression, and substance use. In terms of major depression, by the way, even though that's actually the most disruptive, like that leads to the most sort of premature mortality, lost work days. And I also just want to briefly mention, since I'm aware that there's a lot of women on this call, that postpartum depression, something that people didn't talk about 20 years ago even, now we're aware, like 1 in 8 women probably meet the criteria for postpartum depression. And that is the sort of, after those first few days of giving birth, do you remain sad? Are you remaining irritable? Are you feeling disconnected from the baby? That is depression. And that is something that is normal and something that should be addressed. And then in terms of, I'm just going to move on to looking at youth. The most common disorders are anxiety, depression, and eating disorders, actually. I mean, as kids get a little older, substance use creeps in as well. Want to highlight ADHD here, which is technically not a mental illness, but more of a learning difference, or leads to learning differences. But a lot of kids and then adults with ADHD end up also dealing with anxiety and depression, right? So if you just think about it, like a kid who is constantly being told to settle down, and the teachers are constantly getting frustrated with him or her, and the kid's friends start to get frustrated with the kid's impulsiveness, that's going to have an impact on their sense of well-being. So again, important not to ignore symptoms that seem like they might be consistent with ADHD. And again, just want to highlight that with kids, one of the things that's really important is that, given that, a lot of these symptoms start during, childhood or adolescence, early intervention is critical. And by that, I mean, let's just assume that they're not going to outgrow whatever they're dealing with. And think about it like you want to give them skills like a second language. You want to give them skills like to cope in the same way as you would want to give a kid who's learning a second language, you want to give them coping skills as well, right? So we know that the earlier you learn a second language, the more competent you're going to be in that second language. Likewise, the earlier you're going to learn coping skills, the better you're going to be at using them down the road. And we do know that there are some gender differences in mental illness. Basically, women have higher rates of depression and anxiety. Men, however, are more likely to be diagnosed with substance use disorders. All sorts of reasons for why that is the case. But we also know that women deal with more interpersonal, have higher rates of interpersonal stressors, and are also more likely to experience inequality and discrimination and violence, right? So these are things that might account for some of the differences that we see. Mental illness impacts pretty much every aspect of life, right? School, work. I'm going to highlight 2 things here. mental illness impacts physical health, right? So even for those who want to make it seem like there are two distinct categories of things and that one is real and one is not real, this quote unquote unreal thing leads to physical health problems, right? And I, of course, don't believe that it's unreal. I think it's very real. We'll talk about that in a second. But my point is that, for instance, people with depression are more likely to develop cardiovascular diseases or metabolic diseases like diabetes. So we really do want to make sure that we're not ignoring our mental health. And the other thing is family stress. On the one hand, family stress can contribute to the development of mental health struggles. On the other hand, the mental health struggles of an individual actually contribute to stresses on family functioning, right? So especially if you are the caregiver, it is quite common to have feelings of helplessness, frustration, loss, guilt, compassion fatigue. So we really want to make sure that we're talking both to the person who is struggling, but also to the people who are supporting that person. They need care. And just last thing I just want to touch on is when we talk about what are the causes of mental health disorders, the answer is everything, right? There's a lot of things involved, which is, by the way, why it's not necessarily a one-size-fits model for treatment, because there are lots of different possible sort of factors that can contribute. So there's biochemistry, there's genetics, there's psychological factors, like what coping skills did you develop early on? You know, what's your temperament? There's the social piece. What are your past and current peer relations like? What's your home life like right now? You know, is there bullying? Something we're not going to talk about today, but I think something that's really interesting for Jewish people is generational trauma, intergenerational trauma. Like, to what extent does that contribute? Right. So all these factors interact and make up our mental health. And then any changes to that system can initiate a process that leads to a struggle. And that can be divorce, that can be a war, that can be discrimination. Daphne, it's some of the things that you talked about right off at the start. So I think I'm hoping that answered your question. And I will I'll stop now and I will let you take it from there.
It is impressive how much information you can condense into 9 minutes, and there's still some, obviously, you know, we just touched the tip of the iceberg, and there's still so much more to unpack. And I want to thank you for sharing all of that. And I also want to pivot now to Rabbanit Bracha, who, you know, talks a lot about how passionate she is about taking mental illness out of the shadows. And can you spend a minute telling us why you think it's so important that we are transparent and that we shine a light on mental health issues?
I would be happy to. I just warn you, it won't be a minute. I don't think that's enough time.
No, I'm sorry. I didn't mean a minute.
You meant, yeah, I get it.
I meant a webinar minute.
A webinar minute. Oh, I love that. That's the new term I'm taking with me. I don't actually see who's on, but I really want to personally welcome each person who signed up, who's watching it perhaps afterwards on a recording, for each of you taking the time out of your day, showing that this is important to you for whatever reason it is important to you. And in the middle of the day, it's not, we don't always get so many people. So thank you to each and every one of you. And I want to thank Jofa, who people know is another one of my passions, for offering this space to talk about mental illness, because it really is a passion of mine. And sadly, but you know, you never know what God is going to deal, what cards you're going to be dealt with. We never know. And it does come from my own personal life experiences. And I will speak about that. Taking a breath. Two people very, very, very close to me, almost as close as you can get, struggle with mental illness, and were very much a part of my own life. My sister Gila, Aleha Shalom, who struggled with depression and other illnesses at a very young age, before people really even knew what that was, and almost didn't even have a name for it. And she died at age 54, died from depression by suicide. We were very, very, very close. She was my biggest cheerleader and my favorite chavruta to learn with, and I dearly loved her and love her. And that is a person very close to me who succumbed to a mental illness, whereas on the other side, my first husband, David Jaffe, struggled with depression from maybe his mid-30s, although there were seeds from before, as Anat pointed out as well. And he is a survivor of depression. And although our marriage did not survive it, which I will touch on a little bit later, he did. And I really say he is a survivor, and he's like in remission from depression. That's how I look at it, because depression really never goes away, serious depression. It's always somewhere going to be part of you. And I'm really glad to say he's rebuilding his life. He's living in Israel, and he and I are good friends because we always liked each other, but that entity called depression really, really got in the way between us. Okay. We have 4 children. Our youngest child was about 1 year old. Our oldest one, 11. This was close to 30 years ago. And David had, one more thing I'd like to add. I really have full permission from Gila, alaiha shalom, to talk about depression, to talk about her struggles, because she always said to me, if there's some way that I can relieve even an iota of someone else's suffering, even just by talking about it, please always use my story and my name. So, and I will touch on that a little more later. And David, especially now that he really is well and healthy, has given me his full blessing and consent to talk about our story. So I want to make that really clear. It's not appropriate to do that without the consent of other people involved in the story. Okay. So about 30 years ago, David went through a serious breakdown, and it was diagnosed as depression. And I didn't really know much about what it really was, what mental illness really is. Maybe I don't even know today, but I've certainly learned a lot in the years since then. And I remember sitting in the kitchen with my best friend and saying to her, we're going to make it through. Like, I'm strong, I'm tough, I'm going to support him, we're going to do it. We're going to make it through, thinking this is going to be resolved soon, right? This Prozac was big then. It's going to get resolved. I'm going to support him. I'm going to be there. I'm going to be there for the family. I had no clue how many years, what a long, long, long road this was going to be. And a lonely road. I don't blame myself, but it is partly because of me, because it was so hard for me to open up about it to other people. There were so many years and so many ups and downs, so many moments of hope with a new treatment or a new dosage of the treatment with a new psychiatrist. There were times when David did so much better, and with my rose-colored glasses, I'm like, this is the way it's going to be, but it never stayed that way. And I didn't really talk about it with people. I mean, a little bit I did, but not very much. And after I did come out and talk about it, here were the 2 reactions I got from people in Israel. I was living in Israel at the time. One half said, you're always smiling. You seem so upbeat. It never occurred to me that you were suffering so much in your home life. And there's a lot of reality that when I was with people, I didn't take my angst and upsetness with me, but they felt so bad that they didn't know. And the other half said, the ones who were closer, they said, we could see that hard things were happening, but you never spoke about it, Bracha. So we didn't speak about it. We didn't have language. And maybe you didn't want us to talk about it. And I realized how much I had prevented myself from getting support from other people. Love, support, actual support, like helping in times of crisis, hugs, just somebody on the other end I could text to. Maybe that was pretext, but it could have been a phone call as well. And there were so many years of solo parenting, so many times of making excuses for David. Not that he asked me or didn't ask me, but again, he wasn't showing up at something and I didn't know how to talk about it. And it totally affected our family life and our children, who have learned to understand better, of course, and understand him better, especially as now he is so much healthier and able to really rebuild all the relationships that were severed to some extent and sometimes even damaged. And I'll continue to say that I thought I was like the rock of the family and strong. But I also, at some point, finally broke. And in some ways, that was the best thing that happened in our journey. I was living in America at the time. I came here about 10, 11 years ago and switched from high tech to becoming a rabbi. Whole other story, very blessed. And I wasn't able to navigate the insurance issues. And in Maharat, the yeshiva that I learned in, we talked about mental illness. People gave names to it. People articulated it. People taught me, I didn't know about Gila. My sister was still alive at the time. You have different language. You don't say die, commit suicide. You say die from suicide or die by suicide from depression. That there are other ways to do it. And I really learned that this is a physical illness. And at some point, I crumbled and crumpled. And I realized I had to reach out to people. And guess what happened when I did that? I found so much love. I remember the first person I reached out to in Shul Friday night. I said, I'm at a loss. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to navigate the American health insurance. I'm just at a complete loss. And I reached out to someone who I felt safe. And it turns out was such a safe person. And she and her husband came over to me. And they just gave me virtual and real hugs and said, we're here for you. We hear you. We know that this is hard. And we can even find somebody who will help you navigate the insurance system. And they did. They connected me. And then the first time David was hospitalized for electric shock therapy, which did not work well for him, but we thought it might, there was only myself and my daughter who went to visit him who even really knew about it. But the second time there was a Google Doc and people signed up and visited him, and it wasn't all on us. And there was somebody to turn to and somebody to speak to about this. I want to say that in 2016, when I was an intern at Hebrew Institute of Riverdale during my rabbinic studies, I was just beginning to open up about the struggle that David and I had been through. And I knew I wanted to give a drasha sermon on the topic, but I couldn't name the names. I couldn't speak about that. It wasn't like somebody who goes through a different kind of illness. We didn't feel comfortable. But my sister Gila, with tears, said to me, you're talking about depression? Please use my name. Please, please do that. And I want to tell you, the whole point of that sermon was to say to people, I see you, I hear you, you deserve attention, you deserve love, you deserve not to be alone. And when I say that, I'm speaking to people struggling with mental illness, as well as the families and caretakers and supporters of people struggling with mental illness. I will add two more pieces. Stigma and shame can continue. After Gila died from depression by suicide, some family members didn't want to mention the suicide. No, we shouldn't mention it. And I'm like, no, that's not happening. Gila was not defined only by depression. She had so much more. And if people ask us and we don't give them the answer of how she died, they're just going to be left wondering. I want to name it. She had an illness. She died from this illness. The method that she died is not the most important thing. And after one Shiva visit, a woman called me to the side and with tears in her eyes said that she had a family member who just 6 months ago had died from depression by suicide. She traveled from Israel to the States. Nobody knew about it. She never received comfort. It didn't even occur to her that she should talk about it. And this was such an eye-opener to her. So I gave her her first hug of comfort right there at my own Shiva. And that's the last piece I want to leave people with. There's privacy and there's secrecy. I lived in secrecy for many years. It wasn't good for anybody. It certainly wasn't good for me. It weighed me down. It strangled me from talking many times and from talking the truth. It locked inside the loneliness and hurt and pain. But privacy means we do talk about it. But we decide who to talk about it with people who feel comfortable, people who feel safe with, and people who can give us support.
I just need a minute to absorb all of that. And I want to thank you for sharing from such a deep and personal place and space, and carving out space for both your sister and for your ex-husband in sharing their narratives. So Rabbanit Bracha, you touched on some of this, but I'm going to ask Dr. Geva to expand a little bit. So let's talk a little bit more about what are the ways that we can support others.
Okay. Thanks. Again, I'm gonna just use the PowerPoint as a way to sort of help guide along. But I also just want to say, Rabbanit Bracha, what you say is so moving. And I think I mean, you basically hit it. What's nice is nice or not nice, right? Is about this is, of course, you're so personal, and there's a way that this obviously fits in them with the sort of broad guidance, I think, that we want to give people, that we want people to walk away with. And one of the things is that, when we don't talk, if you're going to leave here with a few things, one thing is you should know that everybody is either struggling or knows somebody who is struggling, right? So like, there's nothing to be ashamed of here. And when we don't talk about it, and when we don't find somebody who we trust, who we feel that we can confide in and get support from, then what we're doing is we're keeping what's happening a secret. And then that sort of, this fits in this sort of cycle of making things more shameful. And that's, not, then that just adds to our burden, literally. But what we really want to do then is really either get support for ourselves or get support or figure out ways that we can provide support for others. What I'm going to talk about right now is about supporting others, but you can sort of also read into this, how can I get support for myself? What is it that I might need? And I like to think of it as there's two kinds of support that people need and that people can provide, right? One is emotional support, and the other is practical support. And these are both things that those who are living with mental illness will benefit from. So the first thing is emotional support, right? And this is genuine compassion, encouragement, sympathy, real affection, right? That's what people need. You're likely not a therapist, so your role is not to solve all the problems. Your role is not to cure other people. But in terms of emotional support, one of the things that's really important is to have is to make sure that people aren't socially isolated. When people are socially isolated, then all they have is the echo chamber in their head, and we get this sort of more of a downward spiral because there's sort of nobody to sort of push people to maybe go out and do things, or there's this sense that they're sort of really alone, and therefore there's the secrecy, and then there's the shame that they feel, and then there's this like baseline level of guilt that people might feel, right, about being a burden on people's time and energy. So it's really important to check in with people. And human connection, that is a basic need. That is like food and water, right? Like, what do we need to live, people? It's food, water, and human connection, right? So maintaining social contact is really important. That can be, and because when you are showing that sort of human connection with others, you're actually implicitly, you are showing them acceptance, and acceptance is often all that people need to know and hear about. And so that can entail sending someone a text. That can entail, calling them just to have conversations with them. That can be finding support groups, and we can talk about that towards the end of the program. Or peer support groups, right? And that, just being with other people can be helpful, or being a friend to that person can be super helpful. Leveraging an existing community. Again, I think in a little bit, we'll talk about, the synagogue as community that you can leverage. That's an important thing. There's also helping people celebrate daily, their daily wins, right? Like even when things are tough and are not working out, there are things that are also positive. So if you think about the fact that when a person is struggling and that every small task can feel like a challenge, just overcoming any sort of small challenge, quite frankly, getting out of bed and making yourself a cup of coffee, that can be the challenge of the day. And if you've succeeded in doing it, let's cheer on that success, no matter how small. Actually, as it happens, on Friday at No Shame on You, we have a talk on gratitude, the practice of gratitude, which is actually one of those things that is very relevant actually to what I'm talking about in terms of the kinds of things that we can do for others and for ourselves. And the other thing is listening without judgment. I think Rabbanit Bracha also talked about this, right? It's just listening, right? Just giving someone the space to talk and to listen and just engage with them so they feel understood, right? You just want to know that you hear them and that you're there for them, right? So responding with things like, that sounds really difficult, or I can't believe you went through that, or I'm here for you. But that's often all that's needed. So that's another area of ways to help others, or things that you might realize you need for yourself. Don't underestimate the importance of practical support, right? So one of the things is when people are, living with mental illness and they have symptoms that sometimes make it really hard to get through the day or to initiate tasks, like that's actually a very common symptom, right? It's like having trouble starting things. It's if you don't know what to say, guess what? You can probably provide huge emotional relief just by helping them do simple tasks that might feel like a burden, right? So this could be sharing resources, like I don't know quite how to help you, but here's a website, or here's a phone number we can, that can help you with. And you can encourage them to seek treatment. And if they don't know how, you can write a script with them about who to call. You can actually be the person to help find some therapists for them, and then make the calls in ahead of time. And even though the therapist can't, there's obviously patient-therapist privilege. There are things you can figure out to make sure that maybe this is a person that your friend can call. And if feasible, you can even accompany them, right? Like, hey, you should go to the gym. Okay, you know what? I'm coming over. We're going to get dressed together, and we're going to go on a walk today. We're going to go around the block twice. That's something that you can also do. And it is really important, though, to respect boundaries, right? So if it's a fine line, not being overwhelming, but there are little things that one can do. The other thing is that stigma is something that impacts people's willingness to seek support. And so one way to support a friend is actually to help destigmatize mental health conditions, right? And the reason that's really important is because we know that something like 70% of people with mental health symptoms often resist seeking treatment, and usually it's due to shame or lack of access. But when you support someone, you help them destigmatize mental illness, what you're doing is you're encouraging them to acknowledge their condition, to seek treatment, and you're helping them feel less guilty about their condition. So stigma is this false belief, right, that people with mental or behavioral disorders, they can't be controlled, or they lack the will to get better, or they're frightening, or they're dangerous, right? And what it ends up looking like then is that, like I said, like people then are afraid to seek help. And then there's other kinds of stigma, which is like maybe bullying that people might experience. There's discrimination in terms of, getting jobs or housing. A whole other session on health insurance and the lack of parity we have. That is stigma extraordinaire. So what can you do to help destigmatize mental illness? One, everyone on this call is doing that. You're improving your mental health literacy. You're learning more about mental health, about mental illness, and then hopefully you'll share what you learn with others, or at least sort of help yourself recognize that there's nothing to be ashamed of. And another way to be encouraging is more subtle, but it's actually with language, right? And I'll just quickly talk about a couple of examples of things to do, or three, I guess we could talk about here. The last thing actually is what Rabbanit Bracha talked about, which is that we really need to stop using the term someone committed suicide or attempted to commit suicide. The term commit comes from the sort of old way of thinking about suicide as either a sin or a crime. And people who attempt suicide or who die by suicide are not criminals. They are people who are vulnerable and we're struggling and are victims, and we need to support them. So we really need to make sure that we're using the right language. Another thing to think about with language is that we want to use first person language and not disability first language. So always think of it like this way. If somebody has a broken leg, we understand implicitly, right, that Rachel has a broken leg, but actually there's a lot more about Rachel. She has brown hair. She loves to study Talmud. She has, 2 sisters, and she was a model UN, expert, right, in high school. So we don't say that Rachel is a broken leg. We say Rachel has a broken leg because there's a lot more to Rachel than her broken leg. All right. So likewise, someone is living with depression. When we say Rachel is depressed, what we're saying is that all you really need to know about Rachel is that she has depression. When you say Rachel lives with depression or Rachel has depression, we're acknowledging that Rachel, not only did Rachel have a broken leg, but she also, this is the same person who was got all those awards in high school for her Model UN performance. And she's still that one who, studies Talmud twice a week. And she's, not only she has two sisters, she has a brother, right? We recognize that there's a lot more to Rachel than this diagnosis. And so it's really important that we watch our language in that way. And then finally, sort of, again, related to all this is let's not use stereotyping language, right? So we don't want to promote the idea that a person living with mental illness is a burden. And so when we say things like someone's suffering from a mental health disorder, the word suffer conjures up all sorts of negative stereotypes and suggests powerlessness, it suggests pain. And the reality is, yeah, but this suffering is a very subjective term. And so we want to use sort of neutral terms, unless we know otherwise. We really want to say the person lives with something or has depression or whatever disorder we're talking about. So I'll stop there. So I think we have more to talk about, speaking of language.
So much more to talk about.
Yes.
And I really want to give a nod to, the use of language. And sometimes we don't realize that the language that we're using is enabling and continuing the stigmatization of the very thing that we're trying to destigmatize. So thank you for that. Rabbanit Bracha, I'm going to turn back to you again. And I want to talk about if we can find supports through our synagogues. I want to talk about what Torah has to say about mental health, what tefillah, if there are tefillot that address mental health. And I think it's important to name this here because we are an Orthodox organization and we do have an Orthodox rabbi participating in this. And so I really want to bring that part of the conversation into this conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I will say that often rabbis are at least one of the first people, or perhaps the first person that people share their struggles or their diagnosis or what they've been going through. Often rabbis are the ones who also notice that somebody isn't coming to shul or doesn't look the same, because we do have that extra, third ear or whatever you want to call it, that maybe somebody is not acting as they were, or maybe we're not seeing them as much as they were. So we may notice, or people may come to us, and thankfully, because then there's a place where people feel safe talking about it first. And the rabbi or any leader, I mean, this could be for anybody, but you did specifically ask about the clergy or about maybe community leaders of one kind or another. So we can offer discretion. We can offer connection because we have our own Rolodex. The Rolodex might be internal to our communities. There are groups that provide supplies or that provide help. We're starting a new initiative called Helping Hands, or provide meals, or the other things that people of the casserole illness type are going to get. People offer play dates for their kids or bring to appointments or offer meals. And so we can connect, but still be discreet. Again, that's about the privacy versus secrecy. And so that's one thing. And then, and we can ask them, who are you comfortable to include? What feels good to you? And sometimes it takes time. Maybe one person, then afterwards it could be one more person. And also as rabbis, we have the opportunity to offer liturgy, ritual, and pastoral Torah. So let me give some examples. First of all, just the very first thing is that things have changed so much, and where mental illness was, and we did touch on this, that mental illness at one point was just thought of so differently. Thank you, Dr. Anat Geva, for talking about that. And today we know that it's a physical illness, but it manifests itself in the way people act, as opposed to a broken leg or a heart disease or cancer or many, many other, well, it's not an illness to have a broken leg, I get that. But the way people act is so much harder. so much harder. Can't you just like not act like that, or not be angry, or not respond, or whatever it is, get out of bed, and of course people can't because it's coming from a physical source. So that's a huge shift. And we know that Judaism is full of the value of life and quality of life, and health it really supersedes in many ways everything else. And whether it is saving someone's life in the moment, and that doesn't only mean somebody who's standing lo aleinu on a bridge. That can be somebody who needs help because somebody with an eating disorder is triggered by fasting. So we offer solutions for that as well. We're aware of that. We understand. Or somebody on Shabbat who suffers from, thank you. Somebody who lives with anxiety may need, I really appreciate it. Even you see, so everybody be forgiving of yourself. Takes time to get the new language. Somebody who's struggling lives with anxiety or depression or something else may need to listen to music on Shabbat. And they come and we can talk about it. We can perhaps find ways to make that happen as well, because we understand that this is a physical illness and people need other solutions. And we can also offer literally blessings, prayers, and pastoral Torah. So if we could share the Mishaberach that we say every Shabbat, and you may never have noticed this little phrase that when we ask for Mishaberach Avotenu, God who blessed our ancestors, and should offer healing. But look at how our sages were so wise. They wrote Refuat HaNefesh or Refuat HaGuf, healing of the soul and healing of the body. And the soul is first, almost as if to say a healing of the spirit or soul, a healing of the body, almost as if to say we're not going to be fully healed. Even if our broken leg healed, or even if whatever we went through healed, we may be left with many vestiges, many leftovers, many remnants of what happened. I shared a story about a person, you can unshare that, a person who received by mistake, it turns out, a pink notice. I don't know if that's called anymore, that he was terminated from his job on Friday. Turns out it was a mistake. But this person slid into a depression, and it didn't just disappear when on Monday they told him it's not true. So there's a healing even when the physical act changes or physical circumstances. You can still need healing of the spirit. And something even from this week's parasha. In this week's parasha, we have the Makkah, the plague of Choshech. And the Choshech, the darkness, lasted 3 days. Something that our sages, Midrashic, learned from this is that during this time, Choshech was so complete, it was so overwhelming, this darkness, not for the Israelites, but for the Egyptians, that it was like a physical presence, which I often speak about depression as this third entity that was in my marriage. There was David, there was me, and there was this third black entity called depression that inserted itself between us so often, and that the Egyptians were frozen in place. They literally could not move. They couldn't get up. They couldn't sit down. They were standing. They remained standing. If they were lying, they remained lying. And that's an overwhelming darkness that I could imagine somebody with a mental illness of one sort or another could feel. It's paralyzed. It could be anxiety that's paralyzing them from moving on, or an eating disorder that's not allowing them to be a fully engaged part in the world. And if you could share the next slide, please. A prayer that a rabbinic colleague shared with me when I was really struggling with the pain in our marriage. And he pointed out to me that even in the prayer, this is one of the blessings we say every day for those who say the evening service, Mariv or Arvit. And it's about darkness and light because it's before the Shema and it's when day turns into night. And we say to God, Golel or mipnei choshech, v'choshech mipnei or, umevi yom umevi laila, umavdil ben yom uben laila, if you could turn to the English now. That it can come in waves, and God can roll away light from darkness and darkness from light, transforming day into night, but also night into day, and distinguishing one from the other. And I used to say those words with so much meaning. It was so meaningful. In that moment, I invited God to be with me and to help move away the darkness, roll it away, and bring it into light. So you could stop sharing that. These are places where a leader, a rabbi, or other leader can find ways to have language to talk with the family or the person to say, our own tradition offers language about it. You're not the first person. We recognize it. This is legitimate. And then if we turn to our community, we also ask others in the community to notice. Do you notice something? Do you notice somebody who hasn't been around? Can you reach out? To be aware, to wait, to not just look at your own circle. And I know post-COVID, this is more challenging, and we've discovered that. But people from the pulpit should be talking about this. When I gave my first sermon 7 years ago, I was inundated and overwhelmed as an intern and a student at the time with people who sent me texts and emails and phone calls saying, you saw me, you heard me, and people reached out and said, I didn't have anybody to talk to about this before. I didn't know I was allowed to talk about it. I didn't know somebody would understand me. So people from the pulpit need to talk about it, need to mention it, need to say, I'm aware of this. I know that this is an issue, and we need to be a community and come together. And lastly, this is something you said as well, the rabbis are not necessarily professional, generally, not professional social workers or psychiatrists, psychologists, but we have our own, so to speak, Rolodex for people to turn to, and we can encourage the people come to us, recognize it, and seek professional help. Seek professional help. That's what I wanted to share for now.
Thank you. I appreciate all of that. I always love when we can tie Torah into real, tangible ways that we can improve ourselves. And I also just want to, both of you use the term, and I know we talked about it in the prep, but for those of you who don't know what a Rolodex is, it is a place where you keep important contact information.
Thank you.
You're
I never
welcome.
owned a real one, but I actually love my virtual one.
I did, and it was like super fun to go through the cards and find the person that I was looking for. So I'm mindful of the time, and I want to note that we were overwhelmed with a number of questions that we incorporated into the discussion, and some unfortunately we were not able to get to. But I guess with our last few minutes here, I guess I want to focus on, what should we focus on? I'm going to throw out a few questions. I'm going to let you each pick up on one. So kind of, the obvious question of what are the resources and concrete takeaways? What is, like, if there's one thing that somebody can do when they leave here, or to keep in the back of their minds for if they ever do find themselves in a position to provide support or need support themselves. And how can we as a community help to educate religious and other community leaders and general members of the community that mental health is part of the whole person's health and is just as important as what they typically see or describe as health. And also, how can we talk with others in ways that preserve family members' privacy, but communicates that something's going on? So I'm going to give each of you 2 minutes.
Well, if it's all right, I also one thing that I always like to take opportunity to bring up is that as of this past summer, we now have everyone knows 911. We now also have 988. So you call 911, 988, sorry, 911, right? You call when someone's life, health, or safety or property is in immediate danger. 988, you can call if someone is in a mental health crisis and needs support. And that can be, by the way, calling for yourself, or calling because you need help for someone else, or calling because you don't know what to do about something and you need some resources. So just remember 988 as a really important number. So that actually was not something I mentioned before, but I'd say that is a real concrete takeaway. Another thing I want people to think about also is that actually for caregivers, there's no shame in seeking help and support. And there are some resources out there. There is, if you have someone living with substance use disorders, there's Al-Anon, for instance. There's we're going to actually send out, I think, Daphne, a resource page that No Shame on You has that also includes organizations that provide also resources and even groups for support groups for caregivers. And actually, at No Shame on You, by the way, we have a support group that we run every other week for caregivers of adults who are living with mental illness. But anyway, there are things out there. Another thing that people might be interested in knowing about is there is another organization called Blue Dove, and they provide educational resources that sort of connect mental illness and Judaism. And they come out, things for the holidays, things, Shabbat, like sort of just this way to sort of connect, I think, sort of your Jewish piece of identity with maybe your mental health or spiritual piece that might need some soothing. So that I'll stop that. Those are sort of, I think, just some things on my end. I have a lot more to say, but we don't have time. So go ahead.
Rabbanit Bracha.
Sure. Be a friend, be loving, be caring. Don't avoid it. Don't avoid people who are going through it. Stick with being simple. You don't need to offer solutions, but you need to allow people to be themselves, to talk about it, and treat everybody as whole people. This is just one piece of them. And I would even say people who are finding it difficult, come and speak to a professional, could be a rabbi. I'm not sure what to do, and that'll give you a space. But the most important thing is really to widen this circle of caring that is it's so obvious to us. Tzedakah, gemilut chasadim, acts of kindness. This comes so naturally to us. It's our highest values. Let's open it a little bit more and include people who, until now, perhaps have not been able to find that, and give them a place to feel loved and cared about and cared for.
Beautiful. So with that, I want to thank you both for your time today, and for all of the time leading up to today. I also want to thank my colleague, Dr. Sarah Krantz-Cement, for being the Wizard of Oz behind the camera. So thank you to Sarah, and thank you to everybody who joined us today. We will be sending out some resources and the recording for those who were not able to join. I know that I learned a lot, and I hope that it will be an added value to my life and to those who seek my support. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Be well. Take good care of yourselves. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.